Sure. Okay. So, on the whole, and we'll work through this slowly, through the process, as opposed to just throwing it right out there, just so that we can kind of get a feel for what people were thinking about this. So when we looked down at this, what stood out that was just different than what we've been seeing?
So there's just that flat depression.
Okay.
And then you can see like vegetation kind of pushed into it.
Pressed into it. Okay, cool. So right off the bat, when we walk by, there's sort of a dark, smooth stain on the ground filled with striations, right? And we're like, huh, well, that's weird. Which, for the skill set of tracking, is basically just an invitation to be more curious about it, right? Where you're like, that's... Now, what's kind of cool for me when I look at this is as I go through file cards, say from this weekend, one of the things that comes up to mind as a pattern that's somewhat similar in some abstract way is all those little wasp things.
Yeah.
And so one thing we might do is, so that's showing that we're suddenly, we're filtering through from our experience, right? Which is very useful. And then we say, okay, cool. But then we're like, well, that's not right. There's big, long striations into the world. And then where were you going? What's the next logical step? What was your process with it?
I started to look around to see if I can find any tracks or anything that may have caused that.
Cool. So we start looking for outside evidence. And then specifically, I mean, that's kind of what we're doing with all this stuff, right? Is we're looking for the thing that made the thing. So then we say, all right, something made that. Can we find more evidence around that? And then where did that particular process take you?
I started looking at striations more, and I saw, and this is, again, the process of the uneducated, but the inside the tracks of one of those is dead pine straw stuck into it, and so I thought, well, there could be the impression of something kneeling on the pine needles.
Nice.
So I looked at the needles on the lowest limb there closest to you, and there's sand on it.
Fantastic. Awesome.
And then I said, so it's the impressions of the pine needles, and the interrogator said, well, what caused that to happen?
Cool.
So I remember there was half a deer track that had been rubbed through by the line, and so I think a deer knelt down on that. They do kneel, but that's the best I could do.
Cool. Right on. Nice. So I like that whole process, because then it was all right trying to figure out what made the marks, and then trying to figure out, okay, look, and Nick pointed this out too. This is the transfer. There's actually, and so this is kind of neat as well. Coming back to the aging concept, what's neat about this is that in a couple days, when I walk through this, see all the sand right here? In a couple days, let's just say tomorrow afternoon even, when I walk through this, all the sand is basically going to be like this. I'm going to cruise through, I'm going to walk through, and do you think that sand is going to stick to this? There's no glue in there anymore. So what's cool about this is that this is one of those things where when we look at that transfer, let's say it doesn't rain anymore and we came here in 5 days and we noticed that. When maybe we'll notice these lines. It'll all be pale ground at that, but maybe we're looking at something over here and we look over and we say, that's weird, what are those lines? And then we do the same thing we just did, and then we notice the transfer on there, which is this red clay with sand in it. And that tells us something immediately. This might be very hard to age at that point, just by itself, the marks. But the transfer tells us everything. Because what that says is, was the ground clay and moist when this was made, or dry and powdery? This is clay and moist. So suddenly we say, whoa, that's crazy. These needles got pushed into the ground. But it was made when it was wet, because there's transfer here. These tracks, whatever this thing was, is like 5 days old, which is kind of just cool in itself, Just another aging thing to throw in there.
So do you think the pine needles were pressed into that and stayed there for a while and maybe help hold that moisture down? Because there's still quite a bit of moisture in that spot.
And
then it just kind of sprung back up, or?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I would say that,
I think the
heel carried off the top layer of sand
Yeah,
and
that could
exposed
be
the
too.
red clay a little
Yeah,
bit
it's-
underneath.
It's the clayey layer.
Yeah.
That's why it looks so dark.
Isn't that funny? I sit there and I looked at that very briefly and thought branch going back and forth, and I knew it didn't quite look
Yeah.
right, but I stuck with that and put wind as the activity, and it's obvious that it's not.
Cool. Right on. So, yeah, in the end, we know that something of significant, and we can actually see the boot in there. We know that something, and I'm not attached to what did it.
I was attached to it.
You were.
That's why I was asking the questions of everyone.
Yeah, because you would probably already look specifically at the heel.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. What I was looking at more, just from a question standpoint, was what made these marks. And what made these marks was pine needles being pushed into the ground. So we'll figure out what we want to deal with, how to deal with that. But yeah, what I see in this, regardless of whether we could see a clear track or not, was that there was a larger surface area that had some heavy compression into it. In which case, this would be more like a deer bed.
Right.
As opposed to a kneel, because we don't have, when they kneel, we know now, thinking about what a whitetail knee looks like, and it's
Right.
going to be a round thing, knuckle size, you know.
Okay.
So these are just all the things we do to piece together, and I like that transfer on there because a lot of times these are the types of things, as opposed to tracks, that we're looking for in the world to follow well. There's actually going to be a lot more of this kind of thing than there are nice tracks on the ground, and so the art of following really is pulling us into our ability to recognize and interpret and continue to stay on the thread of this stuff. Anyway, cool question. Good job.
Thank you. I like, yeah, the transfer is cool stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm glad we were able to show that
Yeah.
because that's a cool element to look for in the world. You can follow hogs just by looking for the mud that they're dripping on vegetation. You can just walk right along and follow.
Yeah.